Welcome to everyone here on the line for the launch of Debt Transparency, the essential starting point for successful reform. To begin with, I would like to thank the other members of the Sovereign Debt Working Group for helping to bring this effort to completion. First of all, to my distinguished co-chair, John Lipsky, Terry Checky, Rich Cooper, Bill Dudley, K.U. Jin, Gail Kelly, Joaquin Levy, Maria Ramos, Susan Siegel, Jose Vinales, and Mark Walker. I would especially like to thank the principal drafters, Rich Cooper and Mark Walker, for their hard work in putting our ideas together. This paper could not have been possible without their dedication and expertise. COVID-19 sparked a sharp increase in sovereign borrowing by developing nations, with total debt held by lower income countries skyrocketing to unprecedented levels. Coupled with tightening monetary policy and rising interest rates, these debt burdens are highly unsustainable, and one can expect that more defaults will occur in the coming months and years. Therefore, many countries, especially those lower income sovereigns, will soon require relief in the form of restructuring. However, today's sovereign debt architecture is inaccessible to many emerging market countries and lacks the transparency needed for effective and efficient liability management. In fact, for post-pandemic debt burdens to be managed correctly in the coming years and to avoid what could become a major global debt crisis, transparency surrounding their acquisition and restructuring must be improved both dramatically and quickly. We should not forget the lessons learned of the Latin American debt crisis, which really shook the world, that began in 1982. Resolute action is needed now, particularly in the area of transparency for both debtor and creditor nations, along with the private sector. And this is a path that this study is aiming to address. Now, I am pleased to turn this over to my distinguished co-chair, John Lipsky. John?
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for your leadership in this project. Now, as Bill describes, the starting point for the Sovereign Debt Working Group is the recognition of the upcoming challenges of restructuring much of the sovereign debt of low-income countries in the wake of the developments that Bill has already described, and we've already been given warnings to this effect by the managing director of the IMF, president of the World Bank, and others. The heart of the challenge is that the existing mechanism for restructuring sovereign debt at present simply is dysfunctional, and the lack of transparency in the markets about outstanding obligations is a foundational issue that must be addressed first and foremost if we are going to build a successful system. Now, the work of the working group centers around two kinds of transparency. The one we all think of when we think of debt transparency is that of data, namely, to have successful negotiations on restructuring debt, you have to start from a common base of agreement about the outstanding obligations. Without that, it's hard to imagine successful negotiations. And there have been substantial changes in the sources of not only the amounts, but sources of debt to low-income countries since the global financial crisis. And already we have seen cases of stalemated renegotiations, restructuring negotiations, because of the lack of an agreed base of data about outstanding obligations. So clearly, progress on data transparency is a sine qua non. But that's not all. The second form of transparency that we have examined is what we call procedural transparency. That is, it needs to be clear before any negotiation for restructuring negotiations begin is that the participants have to have a clear idea about how they will take place and how they will be organized. The underlying insight is that for success in creating a system, all participants need to feel confident that their point of view will be heard, understood, and taken into account. And frankly, neither of these transparencies exist today sufficiently to represent an operational system. So the goal of our report published today is to provide a detailed analysis of the existing problems, along with concrete suggestions about practical steps that could provide remedies. Some in the short run, some will take longer. But essentially, the existing system lacks clarity, but importantly, it lacks incentives for enhanced transparency, and it completely lacks disincentives for non-compliance. Why we think it's important right now is, as Bill has described and others, we face potentially a wave of restructuring requests from low-income countries. The G20 leaders last year already endorsed the creation of what they call a common framework for debt treatments. And the Institute for International Finance recently published an update of its voluntary principles for debt transparency. However, the forms of these initiatives and their scope is simply too narrow. And progress, even on this limited scope, is proving to be far too slow to successfully address the challenge. Now, the upcoming G20 finance ministers that will occur in a little over 2 weeks would be an obvious place to begin making progress. And we hope that our report will serve to encourage a heightened focus on the challenges that lie before us. And now let's turn to a detailed look at the analysis and recommendations in the report. We turn to our colleague and one of the principal drafters of the report itself, Mark Walker. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Emily, Bill, and John for the introductions. Welcome to everyone who's joined our presentation this morning, Eastern Time. As John has said, the report that we've just released takes a deep dive into addressing what kinds of information should be disclosed and how to build voluntary and, if need be, mandatory systems where reliable information can be collected, standardized, and disseminated in usable form and relied on more broadly by market participants, the official sector, and policymakers. I should note that in addition to the importance of transparency in the context of restructuring, it's equally important in the context of the incurrence of debt and new lending. It's important for pricing. It's important for building confidence. It's probably important for reducing borrowing costs to the minimum as trust and confidence increases. The report looks in particular at what institutions could and should play a greater role in promoting transparency, what constraints these institutions have in doing so, how can we provide meaningful incentives that will result in greater transparency, and how can we discourage or perhaps prohibit behavior that does not. And finally, as John said, we look at the question of procedural transparency. The analog in the legal system would be due process, but also inclusiveness in the context of sovereign restructurings. So we'll come back to each of those topics as we go through. The key obstacles to disclosure are first the fact that there is no overarching regulatory regime. And the lack of transparency that we see is in significant part a result of the fact that sovereigns and their lenders have broad discretion except in limited circumstances as to what to disclose and what not to disclose. Secondly, although there's lots of data around, a lot of it is difficult to distill and use. It's in different formats. It's hard to compare. There are lots of institutions that collect data. Some of it's aggregated, some of it is by country, but putting it all together is not a simple task. And so potential investors face the challenge of sorting through and making sense of a significant amount of information across different databases using different assumptions, different terminology. It's really kind of a mess. And so as a consequence, investors may walk away with no clearer picture of a country's true financial situation than they had before they began their inquiry. So what are the current disincentives? How do we create incentives? Sovereign borrowers often lack an incentive, or indeed have an incentive not to disclose, due to what they perceive to be costs and risks of disclosure. These would be political risks, legal risks, financial risks. Political, because what they may be doing is unpopular, or perhaps it didn't follow the appropriate rules and was not properly authorized. Legal risks for many of the same reasons. Financial risk, because if the true story is out, it would be more expensive, if not impossible, to borrow. So many countries avoid disclosure because they think it will be harmful to important interests or lead to less access to capital. But there's another group of countries that lack the institutional capacity and infrastructure to provide greater disclosure. I'm working with a small African country today that has enormous and unexpected difficulty. This is just with their own advisors, trying to explain or trying to figure out how much they owe and to whom. So to create better incentives for disclosure and to surmount these obstacles, we envisage a greater and more focused role being played by institutions uniquely positioned to influence sovereign and institutional behavior. That would include the IMF, the World Bank, other regional development institutions, the Paris Club, the G20, and then apart from on the international side, the credit rating agencies, the private sector itself, regulators, and other regulatory public and private sector bodies. So if we look at minimum disclosure standards and potential incentives, as John said, among other things, we try to build on the good work that's been done by the IIF in their principles on debt transparency and implementation to create minimum disclosure standards. Some of these measures include debtor country legislation or regulations requiring prior authorization of public disclosure of new debt as a condition to its issuance, validity, and enforceability. Having rating agencies augment their disclosure requirements so that market access is conditioned on compliance with good disclosure criteria. We've talked to the official sector about having official and bilateral creditors explicitly condition the provision of fresh funds and debt relief on enhanced disclosure by the debtor and other creditors, a subject which was not warmly greeted, but which we still think is important. Barring private sector lenders from purchasing or holding obligations of sovereigns known to be non-compliant, and creating penalties for the borrower for failure to comply with voluntary standards, such as an increase in interest rate or a mandatory prepayment or loss of favorable tax treatment. We think additionally that the official and regulatory bodies need to take a firmer stance to address confidentiality clauses and obligations imposed by state and private actors that impose limitations or prohibitions on transparency. This is particularly important in the context of distressed disclosure and sovereign restructurings. So our recommendations include the types of information we believe should be disclosed, other categories of information where we believe less disclosure may be warranted. Disclosure should be aimed at improving the quantum and quality of information, but we have to balance that against the burden of providing that information and keeping it current and accurate. As I suggested earlier, in periods of stress, more disclosure is warranted, and we've tried to reflect that in heightened standards in these periods. We believe the Paris Club should provide meaningful guidance to multilateral development banks and demonstrated targeted and public support for global transparency initiatives and proposals. And we support the OECD's efforts to create a centralized and accessible data repository for sovereign finance, which, if adequately leveraged, has the potential to streamline and concentrate data reporting in a manner uniquely beneficial to investors. On the question of debt of capacity, we believe that resources and funding should be allocated to emerging market sovereign borrowers to help them build out their capacity to generate, track, and synthesize financial information so that over time they can have the institutional means and expertise to meet whatever minimal standards are developed. There's also a role for legislation, and we think that debtor countries and lending jurisdictions should consider legislation that would encourage principles of transparency
I think we may have lost Mark. He appears to be frozen.
failed to make
Mark, are
sense.
you there?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, we got you back. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, where did you lose me, Emily? We're okay.
On legislation, probably about 10 seconds ago.
Okay, so I would say debtor countries and lending jurisdictions should consider legislation that would encourage principles of transparency. Such legislation could, for example, require public disclosure of sovereign debt as a condition to its issuance and validity, and could ensure that non-disclosed debt doesn't benefit from tax and other incentives if sovereign borrowers or their lending counterparts fail to make such disclosure in a timely manner. We also raised the question of the creation of a Transparency Institute, which would be a standing body that, given the absence of statutory oversight, could help promote greater transparency and inclusiveness, particularly in the debt restructuring process, could help capacity building in emerging markets, and advise as to legislation. Finally, on the question of procedural transparency, our report offers suggestions on ways to enhance procedural fairness and inclusiveness, meaning making sure that the different participants, as was said earlier, have the opportunity to make their voices heard in the context of restructuring, particularly the private sector. And this is true not just in terms of the private sectors dealing with the official sector, the IMF, and so forth, who tend to act in a way that is less collaborative than other negotiating situations, but also in dealing with the private sector as well. So we focus on engagement clauses, standing creditor committees, and ways in which the private sector can interact more effectively and more transparently with the official sector. So that's in broad terms a summary of the report. It obviously goes into a lot more detail. It has benefited from the expertise of the working group, which includes members on all sides of the financial sector: regulatory, lending, borrowing, official sector. And we welcome everyone's efforts to try to join in a common effort of making this worldwide approach to transparency more effective and happen more quickly. Thank you.
Mark, could you just say a few more words about this Transparency Institute before we move on and open it up?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a totally new idea, but the idea would be to have a standing body, which would have as members people from different sides and different parts of the market, which would have no binding authority to tell people what to do, but would be a resource, or could be a resource, to help resolve issues of what should and shouldn't be disclosed, how to interpret rules, what best practices should be going forward, because not everything is going to be embodied in written rules, and generally act as an aid to help everyone meet the common goal of disseminating adequate information to allow people to make informed decisions.
Thank you for making that clarification. Emily, we turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, John, and Bill. We do have a question from the audience, and I encourage the audience to, please submit your questions using the Q&A function. Our question is from Hong Tran, and I'm going to ask him to please unmute his microphone. As we know, he has a lot of expertise in this space, so some well-informed questions. So go ahead, please pose your questions to the speakers.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the committee to organize this event, and Mark Walker in particular in making the presentation. My question is, one, you recommend to bring China in, which is something that all of us would like to see. But my question is how? How can you get China to join in, to not follow its own policy and its own strategy of dealing with sovereign debt, particularly in the area where we have rising tension between China and US and the West in general? The second question is, you also recommend making use of the OECD digital database as a depository of sovereign debt information. I am curious why picking OECD, because a lot of those debt are incurred by developing countries, particularly low-income countries, which are not members of the OECD, and the OECD itself has not followed those countries in any details and clearly doesn't have the same competency as all the institutions like the IMF. So why not suggest the IMF/World Bank, which already have an extensive database to do their sovereign debt assessment work, to update it and to make it public to market participants? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick up the first part of that, Emily, on China. I think it suits China to be part of this process as the world's largest creditor nation to the emerging markets, because I think the recommendations we make here are recommendations that I think suit China with their one belt, one road, because the more transparency there is, I think the more opportunity there is for China in their programs of lending. And also very, when we talk about China's role, also to be able to get their loans paid back. It suits China to see these countries being able to turn their economies around, because that is the whole idea of the one belt, one road. So as a key player and the largest holder of sovereign debt and largest lender, I think it suits China to be part of the process, and we count on their taking very much to heart the recommendations we make in this report. And one of our members is a prominent professor at the University of London School of Economics, KU Jin. And so we have welcomed the input of our Chinese colleagues who are members of Bretton Woods Committee. The other I will pass to you, Mark, and to you, John, the other part of the question.
Actually, if I let me just add one word on China, and Hung, thanks for the question. Clearly, if the expectations are right, and our base case is that we're going to see what potentially a wave of restructuring from the low-income countries. And I'm sure you noticed in the recent IMF reports that the figure that interest payments on public debt by low-income countries relative to government revenues are now 4 times as high as the advanced economies, whereas only a decade ago, those ratios were similar. So the evidence or the danger signs of a potential wave of restructuring of low-income debt is before us. And as we all know, and as Bill already stated, China is the largest single lender now to these countries, whereas a decade ago, they were almost, it was very small. So there's definitely mutual interest on the part of the Chinese authorities and everybody else to find some kind of a system that works. Because already, as I stated in my remarks, we've seen a case of stalemated renegotiations over the issue of data transparency. In other words, I think back, of course, to my experience during the great financial crisis, in which there was a sense of mutual dependency and mutual challenge that produced cooperative efforts. So if there's an area that could potentially serve the mutual interest of China and its other partners in the G20, this is one of them, and perhaps the most pressing one. Already, as you know, the Chinese authorities have signed on to the G20's initiative of a common framework, but it's just not making much progress so far. So what we're suggesting is a set of practical steps, concrete steps that seem plausible for all sides. The challenge is there, and hence my remarks. We're in 2 weeks, or a little more than 2 weeks, the finance ministers of the G20 are meeting. Let's see if they can get their act together to start to make some new progress. I'll step back. Mark, over to you.
Just 2 words on China, then I'll talk about the OECD. The issues with China are really complex and nuanced. There's the question of how much debt. That's probably much less controversial. There's the question of what are the lending terms, what are the contractual terms of loan agreements. That is more of an issue for China. There's more commonality than one might think, but I don't want to understate the challenges. And it's right now there are issues. We'll see how they play out, right? I mean, Zambia is a good example of a country that about 1/3 of their debt is owed to China. They're about to begin discussions with the private sector creditors. And we're going to see how that turns out. I know from experience that some of the Chinese loans, particularly to the electric power sector, or not just necessarily loans, or investments and advances, are quite complicated and difficult to understand. And contracts that are seemingly unrelated are related. So it's complicated. We'll have to see. But I think I share the optimism of John and Bill that we will be able to make progress with China. On the OECD, we didn't really pick them. The OECD and the IIF, as I think you know, had started already this process of trying to create a common depository of data. The truth is, my understanding is that the IMF didn't want this role, nor the World Bank. I don't think the fact that the OECD doesn't spend an enormous amount of time following the fortunes of developing countries is particularly relevant. This is more an administrative role of receiving, cataloging, and analyzing data and organizing it in a fashion that will be useful to the market. So the OECD has many, many competent people. They seem to be enthusiastic about the task. But I think in any event, that's where we are, and that's where we were before we started to write this report. So I think you know that is this that.
Oops.
Yeah,
Small
I would
brief.
just add on here as a final point that I think that the G20 framework and DSSI, as John and has mentioned, and also Mark, frankly, has not worked. Even the head of the World Bank on several occasions recently, David Malpass, has said that. So we're hoping that by issuing this report before this meeting, we will put a spark in them to really move ahead and put something on the table that functions. And obviously, China, as a major stakeholder in the G20 process itself, apart from being the largest lender, will play its part. So there's no coincidence here in this report coming out and what we say and this meeting of the G20 going forward in the next 2 weeks.
Let me add one more thought. And that is, we were responding to Hung's question, and it's an obvious and important question, since China, since the great financial crisis, has become the largest single lender to the low-income countries. But this transparency issue is not solely a China issue. This is much broader than that. And compliance would involve virtually all countries on the both lending side, borrowing side, private sector, public sector. There's a need on all sides to step up to what we think are adequate standards of transparency. And we think we're going to see that first in this, or the need for this reform immediately or almost immediately in this expected period of great challenge for low-income country debt. But it's a much broader question than just China.
But I think also we should finalize this point and move on, Emily, is that the rating agencies play a key role in all of this. Because without the cooperation of the rating agencies here, a lot of this is not going to work, because they are the ones who rate these bond issues, these sovereign debt issues, and they have to be part of this process itself. And we actually have reached out to at least one of the major rating agencies to get their views on this. So there are a lot of players in this, and we've tried to bring them all together, including the multilateral development banks, apart from the IMF and World Bank. We went to all of them to get their views. So this is really the first report that's gone to all the constituencies involved in this process to try and see if we can put a spark into the G20 meetings, which will take place in 2 weeks. Emily, we turn it over to you to get other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Thank you, John. I think we've unfortunately lost Mark. So we are going to try to get him back.
He's back. He's back.
He's back. Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm going to go to Shabtai Gold from DevX, who has a question. Go ahead, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Great. Thanks a lot for letting me ask a question here and for holding this discussion. I was just wanted to sort of pin down a little bit more specifically how concerned you were about defaults this year and where you might expect them, if you can sort of put some parameters around that. But taking that further, I wanted to get an idea of whether you really think there's enough time between now and when those defaults might happen to get these transparency mechanisms together. Does the G20 have enough time to act, basically, to get the transparency together for rescue packages to prevent disorderly defaults? Thanks a lot.
Well, I would just add very quickly and then turn it over to John and Mark. As I mentioned earlier, this report's supposed to act as a spark to get him moving, because frankly, I think we've all been very disappointed in the lack of progress that they have made. And so we're trying to goad them in a sense and guide them in this report. So John, why don't you pick up on a little bit on that, and also Mark.
Yeah, and not just goad, because we're not just admonishing them, why don't you do something? Thanks to the work of the working group and the hard work of Mark and his colleague Rich Cooper, we have a let's call it a laundry list, a menu of what we think are both concrete and practical steps that could be taken. Not all of them, obviously, as Mark will tell us in a second, I'm sure. Obviously, where legislation is concerned, it's not going to happen overnight. But your question was, could something happen quickly? And I would say, well, look how quickly market views have changed about what's going to be happening with regard, among other things, monetary policy. And to put too fine a point on it, Bill Dudley's former colleagues have listened to him, and we've seen some important changes in expectations about monetary policy in the United States and elsewhere. And this certainly has the potential for adding substantially to pressures in the sovereign debt market, especially for low-income countries. Now, the question is, can everything be solved in time? And the answer, I think that question answers itself. The answer is no. But what we have seen, I'm repeating myself, I recognize, Mark has given us the example of Zambia, which was mentioned in the report, where today negotiations have been stalemated essentially over lack of transparency. As these cases threaten to proliferate, some important progress can be made quite quickly if everybody recognizes the need to get going. And that's what we would emphasize. First, there needs to be a recognition of the problem. Secondly, a recognition of the kind of steps that need to be taken. Third, a sense of urgency that something be done. And here we have a set of steps, concrete steps that could be taken, and time to get going. Mark, are you still with us? And if so, do you have something to add?
I'm still here. Look, a lot of the things that we propose will take a long time and will not be instruments available per se to deal with crises that occur in the next few months. That said, to the extent that people really begin to focus on the importance of this issue and the kinds of things that institutions can do, I think a lot can be done to influence the course of restructurings going forward. But no, to put in place a framework that builds on some of the suggestions, and obviously they wouldn't all be used, it's going to take some time and a lot of effort by a lot of different people. But there's still room, particularly for the international financial institutions, to influence highly the behavior of debtor countries. And there's room for people to say, you want a deal, you want to get something done, we need information. So I think the answer is kind of not the utopia, we won't have it all, but we should be able to make some meaningful progress.
And I hope Bill Rhodes will not be surprised or regret what I'm about to say. He knows I'm about to quote Lao Tzu. Even a journey of 10,000 li begins with a single step. So let's get stepping.
Yeah, that was my comment about goading, because unfortunately, this situation has been lingering here for 2 years. And the various frameworks and DSSI that have been put forward have not been doing the job. And so I think at the end of the day, we're providing guidelines for how all parties can move on this, debtor, creditor nations, the private sector, the rating agencies, etc. So I look on this as sort of an encyclopedia, taking into account what was said before, the work of the OECD, the work of the multilaterals in this area, and the work of the private sector, the IIF. Because if we do not move, I think in very rapid fashion, we are going to be facing a worldwide emerging market debt crisis, the like of which we haven't seen since days of the Latin American debt crisis, when we were fortunate enough to have the leadership of Jacques de la Rosière at the International Monetary Fund and Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve. So with that, Emily, let's go to the next question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all in the audience for bearing with us through some of these technical difficulties today. Zoom seems to be pretty unstable today. I'm going to go to Meg Lunziger. Meg, could you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to all of you for really a number of very useful suggestions. I think it would be really useful if we could get a little bit more in terms of the disincentive side. And you've talked a lot about Zambia. I just remember many years at the IMF, all these programs, IMF and World Bank, put limits on external borrowing. Yet all of a sudden down the road, there was a lot more debt. How did that happen? Because it wasn't captured in the statistics. So how do we get to strong enough disincentives that countries actually make an effort to implement a lot of these suggestions you're making, and we get the information? And of course, it's a fine line because, as you note in the report, I skimmed it quickly, you don't want to cut countries off, low-income countries that are in dire situation from needed external finance. So if you can elaborate a little bit more on how you'd come up with those kind of disincentives to actually get countries to make these changes, that would be welcome. And also, if you have any comments on how to capture what may be called investment and not captured in formal debt statistics, but the terms are really more in the nature of debt, I think that would be very helpful too. Thank you.
Mark, why don't you pick up the whole idea, because you and Rich look very carefully at these so-called disincentives.
Yeah. Well, look, at the end of the day, you can't force people to disclose. And if they don't disclose and no one ever learns about it, it won't be disclosed. Or if it's finally disclosed a year after it should have been, there's not a whole lot you can do. But I think if, for example, you had a rule that said debt, and the question how we define it is really part of your second question, that is not appropriately disclosed, cannot be enforced, you would have the private sector think more than twice before they extended credit without seeing simultaneous disclosure that would ensure the enforceability of the debt. You say that the IMF is not going to, or the World Bank, withhold funds from low-income countries just because they don't disclose. Well, maybe they should. I mean, why should a country be able to say, I don't feel like telling you how much money I owe, just give me more? I don't quite understand that. It's within the government's control. So, I mean, that's certainly one approach. Rating agencies, in order for countries that have market access to have it, they need.
Oops.
Yeah,
Well,
why don't you pick up, John, on that as not only as first deputy managing director of the IMF, but also for a while as acting head of the IMF. So I think this is right up your alley.
Indeed, and thanks, Meg. Thanks for the question. Of course, you're right. You don't think it's when the poor man's starving that's the time to impose harsh discipline. But wait a minute. When the IMF was founded, the Articles of Agreement said, by joining the IMF, you pledge to eliminate payments restrictions on allowed current payments. And at the time, virtually every member of the IMF had such restrictions. And the idea was, working with the fund, over time, those restrictions would be eliminated. And amazingly, it's been a success in that large-scale exchange restrictions that were the rule are now the exception. It seems to me that we wouldn't want to overstretch the analogy, but it's not implausible either. The problem today is that there are no agreed standards of transparency. If there were agreed standards of transparency, then easily this could be part of the IMF's engagement, and that it could easily be a requirement for programs, that concrete progress be made against an agreed set of standards. So I think this is an area that could work very well. And that if the IMF reports and programs included a concrete program or a concrete set of steps to enhance transparency, that would quickly first of all, it's easy to see we make that a requirement of programs, in other words, financial support, but also it's easy to see how that would be reflected in market availability outside of times of crisis. So I think this is an area where we can hope to make progress by engaging the multilateral institutions.
Yeah, and I would just add to what John said, which I think is right on, is that this should apply not just to the IMF, but also to the World Bank, who's a major lender, and to the multilateral development banks around the world. So I think this is uniform to all of them, not just to the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah.
Mark, you had a comment, I think.
Yeah.
Mark, you're on mute. We can see you now, but we can't hear you.
Sorry, I think most of my comments were after I'd lost connection. But I was saying on disincentives, I'm not that sympathetic with the IMF, the World Bank, other lending institutions saying we can't possibly deny help to low-income countries because they don't disclose. Why not? It's within the competence and capacity of the country to disclose. I don't think it's asking too much. We ask countries to come up with economic programs. Why not ask them to tell the truth about what they owe? I don't get that, honestly. And on investment, what I was saying, I apologize, was yes, there are confusing financial transactions where it's hard to distinguish between investment per se and lending. But I think project finance or loans or financing that relies on the revenue generating capacity of a particular project are different from the external debt, if you will, of the country as a whole. But it's tricky. It's tricky.
I think that it's fair to say that John, Mark, and I all agree on this, Meg, on this idea of disincentives. And if you want to look at a good example where this could have been utilized and was not, and which is really an embarrassment for the International Monetary Fund, is a present loan to Argentina, which is going through another restructuring with the IMF, not just a restructuring with its creditors, but with the IMF. And I think if this had been applied earlier on, we might have gotten some greater action on the part of Argentina and maybe less funding that went out to them at that time.
All right, thank you, Bill. I'm gonna be a risk taker here and try to take one last question from the audience, despite the technical difficulties we're having. Coral Dawson has a question. Coral, could you please unmute your microphone and go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to follow on sort of a similar line about whether or not you all have considered an open registry as an incentive. And the open registry then could work in a similar way as discussed a little earlier, where you sort of have priority attention from the IMF or the World Bank if you have registered as a lender, all of your debt by country. And certainly the countries would then need to verify as well that they corroborate that in fact is the debt that they've lended, but it's an open registry and perhaps might be a good task for this Transparency Institute, sort of starting anew, rather than asking a lot of people to track it all down or the governments themselves to get their houses in order. As we all know, that may take much longer than we would like. So instead, saying very similar to the prior speaker, your debt's really not going to, and Mark, your debt's not going to be recognized unless it's actually in the registry, and the registry is open and it's going to be verified by everyone, and it's on you to get your debt registered. Otherwise, you're not going to get paid.
Yeah, Mark and John, I think you were the two that are best able to answer that based on experience. Mark, why don't you start, and then John?
Yeah, go.
Well, I mean, the IMF can't say you won't be paid. The problem, I think, Carl, is loan agreements that are governed by some law, New York law, London law, some law. And unless the agreement says the debtor doesn't have to pay if you don't register, I don't know how you deprive the creditor of its legal rights to get paid if it doesn't register. You could put that in the loan agreement for going forward, and that's similar, consistent with our idea that creditors have to disclose the loans in order for them to be enforceable.
Yeah.
And you can do that either by legislation or you can do it in the loan agreement itself.
And John?
Yeah, that's. I would say, look, the spirit of that recommendation is the spirit in which we've conducted the report. There are various ways to get that done, as Mark indicates. Not all of them are simple, but basically, as we put, the starting point has got to be an agreed standard of minimum standard transparency that is encouraged in the context of incentives and enforced in the context of disincentives. Lots of ways to do it, but that's, as I say, your suggestion is in the spirit of what we think is necessary one way or another.
Yeah, Coral, thank you not only for your very good question, but also for your support of Bretton Woods. So Emily, I turn it back to you so Bill can wrap up the session.
Yeah,
Our distinguished chairman.
Yeah, that's right. We do have several questions that we didn't have time to get to, and just thank our audience again for bearing with us. And you can send in your questions via email, and we'll try to get you responses. Yes, with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Bill Dudley to close us out today. Bill, over to you.
Well, thank you, Emily. So I wanted to start by summing up what we're really talking about here today. It's always good to get the last word. We need much greater transparency in sovereign debt. During good times, it's a means to lower borrowing costs and improve access to credit. And during bad times, I think it can lead to expedited restructuring on terms that actually turn out to be sustainable. So it's good for both good times and bad times. But to get there, and this was raised in our discussion today, we need to change the incentives for disclosure for both borrowers and lenders. And this study, I think, explains not just why we need to do this, but how we can do this. And it's also a call to arms. So let's get going on this. Second thing I want to do is just thank everybody who contributed to this insightful and timely study. That starts with the Secretariat, Emily Slater and Lena Toscana, who's our program director. It obviously includes the co-chairs, John Lipsky and Bill Rhodes, and Rich Cooper and Mark Walker that held the pen on this really excellent study, and the other members of the Sovereign Debt Working Group that contributed to this fine paper. Obviously, we also want to tip our hat to the membership of the Bretton Woods Committee itself, because none of this would be possible without the support of our membership. And of course, I want to thank everybody who participated in this session today, because I thought the questions were extremely insightful. Lastly, let me just say that there's more to come. Not only further studies from the Sovereign Debt Working Group, we're going to do some more work there on equitable burden sharing, private sector participation, and state contingent debt instruments. So more to come from the Sovereign Debt Working Group. But also, we're going to be doing more in other areas. The Future of Finance Working Group is up and running. We formed 2 project teams, one to tackle the issue of digital currencies, the other to tackle the issues of climate finance. So the Bretton Woods committee is moving forward on many, many fronts, and we're very excited about that. So thank you all for participating today.
Yep, thank you, Bill. And I'll just echo the gratitude and appreciation for the working group, the co-chairs, the drafters, the BWC members who provided input early on in this process, and also all of the external stakeholders which the working group held consultations. Several of them are on the call today. So thank you for your input and your insights. Once again, the report is now available on our website, so go there to download a copy. We'll also be circulating it to our membership, of course, later this afternoon. And without testing our luck anymore, I think I will sign us off for today. So thank you everyone for participating and attending.